Hello, my name's Roger Coghill, and I want to give you a talk about the Atlantis story. And if you look at the first slide, you'll see that I've divided my talk into 4 parts. One is about the origin of the story itself. The second part is about where Atlantis is located, and the third part is the language of Atlantis and how it came to be. And finally, and probably most important, why this story, which is over 2,000 years old, is so important for us all today. Right, well, before I start, let me tell you, my name is Roger Coghill, and there are my degrees on the screen. Why should I be the one to tell this story? Well, I'd like to give you some of my credentials so that you will accept that. First of all, I was an open scholar in classics at Emmanuel College, Cambridge University, and also at the same university I became, after that, a senior exhibitioner in biological sciences. They very kindly let me do 2 degrees. Later on, I gained a master's degree in environmental management from the University of Wales, where I used to live. And I was also appointed a member of the UK Institute of Biology, which is now called the Royal Society of Biology. And I was a former technical committee member of the Bioelectromagnetics Society of the United States, which arguably is probably the most important scientific society of its kind in the world. And finally, I was formerly an advisor to the United Kingdom government on the arguable and putative exposure risks of what we call EMF, electromagnetic fields, and how they impact on organic life today. And I was in that role a member of what were they called the SAGE committee. So those are some of my credentials for being able to tell you this story. Well, let's move on. Why do I want to tell this story, and what's new that you don't already know? Well, because I have a degree in Greek, ancient Greek, I was able to read the actual Greek text set down by Plato, and not any subsequent speculations and claims, of which there are many thousand. And so I've been actually working from the original document. For example, in it, Plato describes the walls of Atlantis. They're actually sea walls, and the ships that arrived there used to moor between them. And he says the entire circuit of the wall, which went all round the outermost zone, they covered with a coating of brass. And the circuit of the next wall, because they were concentrically inside each other, they coated with tin. And the third, which encompassed the citadel, because Atlantis, says Plato, wasn't just a city, it was a whole region with a citadel in the middle of it. And he says this citadel flashed with the red light of something called orichalcum, which is another metal, and that metal, translated into modern language, is mountain copper. So they had those 3 metals performing a role in that city, and I want to talk about that later. So my talk will not only include new archaeological and scientific discoveries, but also literary discoveries about the actual location of the Atlantis city as described, and only described, by the philosopher Plato. And what I think you should know from the outset is that Plato, in his text, says this is not a myth, it's not a legend, it's a true story. And I have used completely accepted science accepted by mainstream scientists, to explain the warning contained in Plato's dialogue about Atlantis to the world today. Okay, let's move on. First of all, I'd like to show you a picture. It's not, well, it's painted by a famous painter called Raphael. The School of Athens, as they called it in Plato's time, and he painted a picture called the School of Athens, in which he depicted Plato. But since he painted it in 1500 and something, it's very unlikely that that's actually what Plato looked like. But I thought the picture is quite important and very commonly used in this issue. Anyway, so we've got the only place where you will ever find the original source of the Atlantis story is from Plato. It appears in two of his dialogues. He had all these dialogues between young men and Socrates, the philosopher Socrates, written down by Plato, but about Socrates. And the two that report the Atlantis story, notice I call it a story, not a legend, is the Tsunamis and the Critias. And they're both parts of a two-day discussion with Socrates. And Plato wrote these two dialogues around about 360 BC. Okay? Well, you know, these dialogues of Plato don't turn up ready printed and translated into English. They start out looking a bit like this papyrus. This is a fragment of papyrus of a Plato text found in a place called Oxyrhynchus in Egypt in 1897. Actually, Oxyrhynchus itself has an interesting story, because it was actually a rubbish dump. The local bureaucracy decided that there was a whole load of paperwork which they didn't need anymore, and they couldn't use it anymore. In those days, people used to write on papyrus, and they would, if one side was used up, they'd use the other side till it was finished. But in this case, they used both sides, and so they decided to chuck them away and burn them. So they took them out into the desert to burn them and set fire to them. But a sandstorm started up, and it blew out the fire and covered it up with sand, so that all the fragments that had been intended to be burned were still there, thousands of years later, discovered by some British archaeologists. And they found amongst them some very important Greek writings, like plays by Menander, and also found these fragments of works by Plato. So that's how it starts out. But what I worked from is the kind of cleaned up version, which is more like what you see in modern Greek letters today. And this is a part of the original Greek text I worked on from Plato's dialogue Tsunamis. And there you are, you see it's all in Greek, and a modern Greek could read that. But you know, this word Atlantis, everybody uses it, everybody knows it. I live in Madeira, and Madeira lies in the Atlantic Ocean, one of the 6 big oceans of the world. Everybody knows that. And where I live in Funchal, I see that there are apartments to rent out called Atlantida. And I know that there was once an airline, part of TAP, called Air Atlantis. And there's a restaurant called Atlantis at Caniso, up the road from me. And then everybody also would know the space shuttle Atlantis, and there's even a butterfly, Vanessa Atalanta. So there are thousands of times where this word Atlantis has been used. It's a very common one. It's buried in the human consciousness, one might argue. And even a milk carton, where I get my milk from the local supermarket, lo and behold, Estrella de Atlantico, which means the Star of Atlantis. Now, for centuries, people have been trying to find out where this Atlantis is. To be honest, no one until me has found it. And there's been plenty of opportunities for claims. I mean, some of the places that people have said it is are on my list here. Sweden, Ireland, Santorini, that's used to be called Thera in the Mediterranean, it's an island. The Bahamas Islands, Bermuda Island, Mexico, Spain, Brazil, and so on. Mainland Greece, Germany. One very educated guess puts it at Silves in Portugal, not far from where it actually is, to be honest. But he recognises my priority in pointing out that it is in actually the southern part of Portugal. Anyway, even with Antarctica has been found there, apparently. So there are all these places wrongly claimed. Most of the people making the claims haven't been able to read the original Greek. They've had to use the translation. So let's just hit the bullet notes of part one. The first and only origin of the story is from Plato. The story is only in two of his later dialogues, the Timaeus and Critias. And Plato says that this rise and fall of Atlantis is true, not a myth, and actually he got this story himself from his own great-grandfather, and his great-grandfather got it from Solon, a 6th century BC lawmaker, one of Plato's ancestors, therefore. And they say it occurred around about 9000 BC. Well, that's before our history. It's prehistoric. And anyway, let me finish by pointing out that, you know, this huge number of articles, films, videos and books about Atlantis show that this word Atlantis is deeply embedded in our human consciousness, and with all these different claims of where it happens to be. Okay, that's part one. Now part two. Well, let's look at where it is. Where does Plato say it is? Well, he actually gives us lots of clues. First of all, he says it's outside the Mediterranean. So we can discount all these ideas about Santorini and mainland Greece and Cyprus. It's got to be outside the Mediterranean. Plato actually says so. In fact, the way he says it is this. He says he calls the Mediterranean a puddle, compared with a huge ocean, he says, which exists outside the Pillars of Hercules. Now, he called them the Pillars of Hercules, but we call them the Straits of Gibraltar. There's no argument about that. It's a little gap between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Interestingly, only about the Egyptians could get out of the Mediterranean because there was a constant incoming, inflowing current of around about 12 knots, which made it almost impossible for any sailing boat to go against that. But the Egyptians could go against it because they had triremes, which had 3 banks of oars, and these oars could row against that current and get out into the Atlantic. And the reason they did it was so that they could trade with the people in Africa one way and Spain and Portugal the other way. Now, all these facts that Plato gave about the Atlantic are also correct, and quite amazingly, he says in this big ocean there are little islands called like stepping stones, and he says they are stepping stones to a huge continent the other side of the ocean. Now that means that Plato was aware of the existence of America well before Columbus. Now Columbus might have known about Plato's work, because what happened to Columbus was that he tried to persuade the King of Spain to give him a fleet to go and find spice going westward, whereas the normal overland journey was eastward, and it took a long time, it was very expensive, so spices were very costly. But Columbus thought he could go the other way, cross the sea to get to the Spice Islands, and he could do it a lot cheaper. But the King of Spain wasn't going to have any of that. So Columbus spent all his money and he became penniless. So after that he went down to southern Spain and stayed in a monastery because he was poverty-stricken, and where there was an old monk. And he and the old monk used to chat, no doubt, over the fire in the monastery. But it turned out that the old monk happened to be previously the tutor for Isabella, the Queen of Spain. And so Columbus and the old monk went back up to see the palace and the Queen and the King of Spain. And this time, because of his connection with Isabella, Columbus managed to get the king to give him the opportunity of making that journey across the Atlantic. He sequestered 3 ships from some miscreants down in the south and left Columbus to do the rest. Well, Columbus had a terrible problem because he couldn't get any of the Spanish crew to come with him on his journey. They thought they were going to fall off the edge of the world. So he went to Portugal and to the Algarve, and he found there was a legend about Atlantis there, and therefore he was able to get the crew. They thought they were going to go and find Atlantis, and he thought he was going to go and find the Spice Islands or Spice areas. But anyway, that's how it all started, and that's the background of what Plato said. So now this is all accurate. So you can say that Plato's own description of Atlantis now, he says, A, it's outside the Mediterranean. B, he then mentions Madeira as being an adjacent city at the eastern end of the Atlantis region, because he calls Atlantis a region, not just a city. Now we know about Madeira. Madeira was the original Greek word. As it went into Latin, they softened the G, and then it became Hades, which is very well known to the Romans or the Latin peoples as being hell. And they thought it was the place of hell. And then later on again, the Hades changed to Cadiz, and everybody, no one disagrees with the claim that the original Madeira mentioned by Plato is actually our modern Cadiz. So what he's saying is you go out of the Straits of Gibraltar, turn right, go past Cadiz, and then he says you will come to a city in the centre of a south-facing coastline with high sea cliffs of white, black and red stone. Now that sounds just like the Algarve, but there's one big problem. There's no island there. The Algarve is part of the Lusitanian Peninsula. So Plato keeps talking about an island, and there isn't one. And that is what's confused everybody. But let me tell you this. This is why the Egyptians could trade outside the Med. They had their triremes, by the way. Anyway, so, and here's a typical example of someone trying to think of an island being in the middle of the Atlantic. Well, there isn't one, of course, but here's a typical error made by authors reading the story only in translation, and the translation is always an island. But in Plato's day, the Greeks used the word for island to include a peninsula. Let's give you some examples. In mainland Greece today, there's a well-known area called the Peloponnese, and that actually means the island of Pelops. But of course the Peloponnese is a peninsula. And there's another one, there's the Chersonese Peninsula. Now Chersonese is the island of Kherson. But of course they're both peninsulae, and for once upon a time the Greeks didn't have a word for peninsula. Paine insula is the Latin word for peninsula, comes from it, and it's a Latin word, it's not a Greek word. Almost an island, it means Paine insula. So Plato says that this Atlantis region was a city, and so he's not just talking about one city, he's talking about a whole area. Okay. And if you translate correctly the word Nesos, which is the Greek word for island, as peninsula, as Plato intended in his text, the description is complete and it fits exactly the identity of the Algarve and its capital city, Faro. Okay? Excuse me. And what Plato actually says is it's in the centre of a south-facing coastline with high cliffs of black, red and white stone and with Cadiz near its eastern border. And that's just as an accurate statement as Plato's description of the American continent. I mean, he was accurate from one end of his talk to the other. And here is a picture of the Algarve coastline. And look, there are the red, black and white rocks that he talks about, stones that he talks about. There are the high cliffs. And there's the big plain that he also mentions. He says it's on a peninsula with a fertile region, a huge plain with a major city in the centre of its south-facing coastline. There we are. It's exactly what you see today. And here is an aerial view of Faro today. And how Plato describes Faro is like this. He says it's got a seawall which goes all the way around except for a place where you can go out of or into the sea. And then inside there are walls that are built up, and these walls can come up so big that they can house the incoming ships and moor them up and obviously unload or load up their cargoes. And those walls are built from those red, white and black stones, and they have cladding in the form of metals. And interestingly enough, he very specifically says those metals are different metals. They're not all made of one metal. He says one wall is made of brass, one wall is made of tin, and in the middle there's a red mountain copper, he calls orichalcus, mountain copper, which glows with the shining light of the citadel. So that's his description. And he goes on to say, the largest of the harbours were full of vessels and merchants coming from all parts. This is obviously a serious international trading city, and who from their numbers, he says, kept up a multitudinous sound of human voices. I can imagine them all arguing about the price of the goods, and the din and clatter of all sorts, night and day. And that's a translation from the actual text. So there you are, you can see exactly what Plato is talking about. There's that outer wall. Inside it you can see the channels, and then at the top of that picture you can see the citadel itself. Okay, but you know, the kind of pictures that people have drawn from similar descriptions in translation are nothing like what we see today in modern Faro. But here's one example of the kind of thing you can see in many of the literary attempts to draw the picture of Atlantis city. Okay, now where is that? They're talking about the Algarve, and where's the city in the middle? Well, there's only one, and that's called Faro, and it derives its name from the Greek word for lighthouse, or pharos. I mean, you see the word pharos in many different languages. In France, headlights of a car, les phares, and I think there's also the same kind of thing in Portugal and Spain. But the point is that Plato mentions a shining citadel. Now, why should there be a shining citadel, a lighthouse citadel? And that the reason is pretty obvious, really. If you are a trading city and you want ships to come safely to your harbours, then you need to show them where to come. And to do that, you need a lighthouse, because otherwise those cliffs, which run all the way nearly along the south-facing Algarve coast, would be the scene of many a wreck if they didn't know where the harbours were. And Plato describes this citadel of Atlantis city as shining like a torch, not like a reflected light like a mirror. That's a different Greek verb. Shining like a torch. It was intrinsic light, and clearly it was an important maritime trading port, and like every other port of any substance, you have a lighthouse to show people where it is. Now, how on earth did anybody light a lighthouse in 2,000 years ago? Now, Plato actually gives us the clue. these metal-clad sea walls, huge sea walls clad with metals. That's the clue. I'm going to move on now. So let's just summarize that. He gives a very detailed description. He says it's a large bustling city with huge docks for ships where imports and exports occurred. And he says that visiting ships were berthed in a three-ringed harbour with high sea walls, built from the black, red and white rocks around, and then clad with tin, brass and copper. The copper, by the way, came from the local mountains, he says, the orichalcos, that's his word for it, mountain copper. And I have to tell you that behind Faro, in the hills, are the biggest and oldest copper mines in the world. They must have had so much copper they didn't know what to do with it. It even flowed red down the rivers. The Rio Tinto in southern Spain is because of the alluvial copper. And in order to offer safe landfall, the citadel in the central hill of the city was crested by a large shining lighthouse. It makes sense. Well, I'm going to now put forward an idea which no one else has. And that is that this civilization had learned somehow crudely, maybe not so crudely, to make electricity. And that electricity was how they powered the lighthouse. Now you might think that's absolutely ridiculous, but the fact that those sea walls were sitting in salt water of different metals makes the idea of a huge battery tenable. This is what Plato was describing. He didn't realize he was describing a battery. He didn't know that. The Greeks had no idea of electricity, but the civilization before them did. And I could imagine that accidentally, if you have a load of zinc and copper not far from each other, sooner or later someone's going to accidentally notice that there's a movement between the two. Okay, here's the battery. This is how it's done. There's zinc on one pole, copper on the other, and salt water in the middle. And what happens then is that electrons flow from one to the other because of the dissimilarity of the metals, and that flowing stream of electrons is enough to light a lamp. Now you might say, oh well, there's no vacuum. But you don't need a vacuum. It's just to preserve the length of the lamp. You don't need a metal to glow. I've seen Japanese lamps or torches made from a bamboo filament. You don't need to have a metal one, but they may have had, and I don't know the answer to that, nor does Plato. All I can say is those sea walls connected up the way out this you see there would make a battery sufficiently big to make a lighthouse. And that is the discovery which I am the only one so far to have made. So, if you take the conclusions now, part 2, Plato accurately describes the Algarve as the location of the Atlantis city. He says it's actually part of a big region. His text strongly suggests that this ancient people had discovered how to make a tin, copper or zinc battery. We didn't know how to make a battery until 1790 odd, when people like Volta and Luigi Galvani started realizing that there was a force in the world which could radiate at a distance and could create a battery. We didn't rediscover that until that sort of time. But this ancient civilization used that knowledge to create a lighthouse as a safe landfall on the dangerous Algarve lee shore for trading vessels coming from Egypt. They built huge harbours and jetties to handle the amount of trade, and there was a noise, as you know, Plato described it, of all that trading going on, all the deals being struck, particularly in copper and tin, of which there are copious local deposits. And that's the conclusion of part 2. Let's move on, part 3. Well, I would have thought by now you begin to believe me, because it's all pretty hard science. But let's now look at the next possibility. In his dialogue, Plato actually wrote I don't know what they call the city, but if I were a Greek and I translated it back into Greek from its original language, I would be calling it Atlantis. Now, why did he say that? You know, the god, the Greeks were polytheic, and they had lots of gods, and one of them was Poseidon, and it was Poseidon who, Plato says, founded the city of Atlantis. Now, Poseidon, we know Poseidon today as the god of the waves, sea waves, and later Neptune. But actually he was the god of all kinds of waves. Poseidon doesn't mean sea waves. Poseidon means the shaker of the earth, because he was the god of earthquakes as well. Now here are some waves. The top one in my slide is a sine wave. That's a normal sine wave. Then the middle one is what people call a dogtooth wave. And then down below is a square wave, and they generate electric fields differently because of their shapes. The faster they rise, the rise time as it's called, the more electric field they make from the magnetic field. But that's nothing to do with this talk. Anyway, I'm now going to try and draw for you, if I can get it to work. Yeah, the word, here's a dogtooth wave, and this is how, a dogtooth wave by itself doesn't convey much information. You have to add things to it. It's a carrier wave, and you have to put things on it to make it give information. Now let's start putting some things on these dogtooth waves. If you draw a line across the first one, you get an A. If you draw a line at the top of the second one, you get what the Greeks would regard as a T or tau. The Greek Taurus stands for bull, and the way they drew the bull was like with little horns like that. So the Greeks would read that symbol, the second symbol, as a T. The third one, if you don't put anything on it, they would see as a lambda, which is the capital L. And if you draw another line like a bar across it, you get an A again. And if you add a line, or take one from the next one, you would get an N from your shape. And then another T there. And then if you just take one of the lines away, you get an I. And if you turn these dogtooth waves on their side, you get an S. So from our original dogtooth wave, which hasn't got any information on it, but is one of the waves, I guess, which Poseidon would have ruled over, and you start adding these little bits and pieces, you then get this word Atlantis. Now, it probably didn't mean what we think it means. It didn't read Atlantis. But if a Greek saw that, he would say that reads like Atlantis. And that's exactly what Plato says in his dialogue. Okay, there's only one place on Earth you're going to find those signs, those glyphs, and that is all along the Algarve coastline. Here it is. Here's the full language. This is not just the T, there's the T there. It's not just the A, but it's all the other bits they did to those signs to make them work. There's the lambda there. And that's called the Southwestern Algarve script. And the northern script is a bit more advanced and a bit more different. It's as if they added a few more synths. But that is where you get those signs, nowhere else in the world. Here is one of the stones on which they are carved. Now you can see them very clearly there. There's an A. Next to it is a T. Somewhere or other there'll be another A there. Is an O. But you can see that's the kind of signage, that's the kind of symbols, the glyphs that they had. There's a lambda there. And that is on a stone found in Lagos, in the Algarve, in 2008. And let me tell you, there are 75 similar inscribed stones from the Algarve coastal area. And some of those are in the museum at Faro. And there are 20 more at the new Museum of Writing in above Faro. Here's the full text the list that we know of. There's the A, there's the lambda, there's the tau. You see, as you might argue that's an S there. Seems like there's an M as well. And there's a phi, a Greek phi. There must have been quite a few letters similar to the ones the Greeks knew, as well as ones they didn't know. Anyway, and here's another example of that sign work. This is what you see all along the Algarve. Here's an actual photograph of one. You can see the signs, that's the way they made them. Okay? It's actually in one of the museums. So here is a more relief version of it. There's, you see the sigma there. That would be an N. And so on. These are some of the other signs they used, which Plato doesn't mention. Anyway, let's look at, this is the area I'm talking about, and there is Madeira, or Hades, or Cadiz, on the bottom red arrow. There's Faro, exactly where Plato said it was, in the middle of the south-facing peninsular coastline. And that black area is where the language was found. Other languages, more advanced than that, are different colours, but they're nowhere near the Algarve. And they're not quite the same either. But they're altogether called the Paleo-Hispanic languages. So, the conclusions I would draw from part 3 of my talk are that the yet undeciphered glyphs found all along the Algarve coastal region match the original Plato's description of how the word Atlantis came to exist. And those glyphs are not found anywhere else than the Algarve. There we are. Well, let's continue to part 4. Part 4. Now, in part 4, I want to talk about the message which Plato contains in his dialogue. Plato explains that Poseidon taught the Atlanteans to become technologically advanced. He doesn't use the word electricity because he didn't know about it. But he says that this advancement caused them to commit the sin of hubris, that's a Greek word, by thinking themselves superior to the gods, and loads of gods, the polytheic culture, i.e., we would translate that really as superior to nature. In ancient Greek mythology, this hubris, this overweening behaviour, is pursued by nemesis, which is a punishment. And in the dialogue of Critias, Zeus calls a meeting of the gods to debate the hubris of the Atlanteans, and Poseidon, who had started Atlantis out in the first place and shown the citizens these technical skills, was asked to sort it out. And then, Plato says, accordingly, in one dreadful night and one dreadful day, Poseidon threw a huge tsunami at Faro, or Atlantis, and covered it in mud, destroying the people and their technology. Forebodingly, in the Critias, the dialogue breaks off. It doesn't finish. The Critias doesn't finish. It stops suddenly at the point where Zeus assembles the gods of Olympus to discuss the Atlantis problem. So Plato leaves us wondering what happened in that debate. We know the result, but what were the comments being made? First of all, let me tell you a bit more about Poseidon. Plato says the region and the city of Atlantis was founded by Poseidon, the god of waves, and we think of him as the predecessor of Neptune, and that would cover sea waves, and that would, I suppose, it cover tsunamis too. But as I said, Poseidon literally means shaker of the earth, so that's where we get the Greek word seismology from, by the way, Poseidon. Seismo means to shake. The science of earthquakes or earth waves, so not just sea waves. I think of Poseidon as the god of all the waves, and I think of him including electromagnetic waves, but that's only my speculation. The Greek myth before Plato's time relates that Poseidon fell in love with a mortal girl called Plato, who bore him 10 children. And these were all twins. There were 5 sets of twins. And according to Plato's version, the eldest pair of twins were Atlas and Eumelos. And Poseidon, he says, gave the Atlantis region to Atlas and his wife, and his brother, and he gave the Gadaira region to Eumelos, his brother, and the 4 other twin pairs got other parts of the territories, but not specified. So that's how Poseidon says Atlantis began its own existence. And if you go to the Municipal Museum at Faro, what would you find but an amazingly beautiful mosaic, very detailed, of Poseidon, although of course to the Romans he was Neptune, actually sitting there on the floor of the museum. Huge thing it is, very pretty. Okay, now let's say what's a little bit about tsunamis. Everybody in Portugal and half of Spain will know about the famous 1755 tsunami which wiped out the city of Lisbon, Portugal capital. 60,000 people died in Lisbon from that one single day's tsunami. But the accounts say, or the calculations, the modelling says that the effects were worse along the Algarve coast than they were in Lisbon. And the mudflats that were resulting are still there inside that seawall today. Here's an example. If you look at it, you'll see from the map that there's number 9 force, and here's number 10 along here. See, it's much worse. And the reason why that tsunami happened was because of what's called a subduction. A subduction is where one tectonic plate slides under another, and in the sea outside the Lusitanian Peninsula, the African plate is sliding across the European plate, and now and again it sticks. And then if it moves suddenly after a few centuries, that's what causes the tsunami. Now that happened in 1755, and there was a minor one in 1969, but that was 50 years ago now at least, and 200 odd years ago, for the famous Lisbon Great Tsunami. So it's about time we considered that it could happen again. And what's happening? By the way, this subduction area is called the Azores-Gibraltar seismic belt for you pundits. This is a contemporary account in English described this tsunami in detail. Terrible. And here's a picture drawn at the time of what it looked like. And then underneath it I put Portuguese and underlined the area saying, especially in the zone below, and it did damage to a large part of the Algarve coastline and Setúbal. So there you are, you see, that's the confirmation of that. Well, the question one has to ask is, because of this subduction problem, could there be another Atlantis catastrophe any minute? And there are 3 major features of the risk. One, that this tectonic plate subduction could move again. 2, that the huge Antarctic icebergs, the Larsen C Iceberg and so on, are breaking off and melting, and that is increasing ocean levels and allowing glaciers to slide into the sea and add to that problem. And there's also the same thing happening in Greenland. Greenland's nothing like as green as white as it used to be. It's coming to be a green land again. And then finally, as if that wasn't enough, there's a big problem with an unstable land mass at a place called Cumbre Vieja in La Palma, which is on the end of this fault line. So we've got 3 major problems now that could be the cause of another tsunami. And the reason for the increased risk is global warming, man-made carbon oxides permeating the atmosphere as a result of human technology. We think they're so clever, but we've been deforesting, we've been increasing vehicle exhaust gases, we've been producing electricity and simply breeding an enormously increased population. And this global warming is melting ice all around the world. This in turn raises ocean levels, and the ocean levels, the increased water weight, is pressing down on subduction plates, creating chaos all over the place. That is a very real risk. So, I mean, the Larsen C Iceberg was the biggest iceberg ever known in history, bigger than Madeira Island, and it could add 10 centimetres to ocean height. Well, that doesn't sound a lot, but you think about the area, and it means many millions of tons being pushed down on that subduction plate. And it's happening much faster. The ocean water levels are rising much faster than scientists thought they would. Here's the Larsen C Iceberg. And this is what's happening in Greenland. This is what it was like to the left of the picture in 1995. That's it. The middle one is 2002, and the one on the right is 2005. This comes from a book by Algarve in 2006 called An Inconvenient Truth, very well worth reading, but he documents many different examples of the global warming that I've been talking about. I mean, you don't need to go very far, because on the news all the time you see comments about floods. Here's one in Miami in August 2017. You're getting increasing sea levels, threatening whole islands in some parts of the world, and it's getting worse. And then you've got this problem at the La Palma landslip site at Cumbre Vieja. And there have been rumours that, I mean, this isn't me talking, this is now several different universities have estimated that a La Palma event would give rise to a tsunami with up to 50-metre waves when this big chunk of land falls into the sea. And some people say it'll go right across the Atlantic, not just hit European cities like Lisbon, but it'll go and devastate a third of Florida. It will inundate Manhattan. And if you think about all the big cities in South America which are vulnerable, I mean, you know, it's going to be like, here's an example of one of the models. There's the place where it is. It's quite away from the Algarve, but not that far. And these are the heights of the water of the waves from the tsunami, and these are the hours it takes to be there. So you can see that within 3 hours from La Palma, it will have hit the Algarve well less than 3 hours, and it'll by 6 hours it will have got to North America and all these cities in South America, and by 9 hours it'll be hitting mainland USA like Manhattan. That's one forecast. This is another one. This is the way they're looking at it. This is the time in 30 minutes. In 30 minutes it would reach Madeira. In 1 hour it would reach the African coast. And you can see that they're talking about very high waves. 50 odd meters in some places, 12 meters. That's not what the populations had prepared for. Here's this big chunk of land I've been talking about in La Palma. It slips down the mountain. And so the conclusions I have from part 4 of my talk are that there are 3 elements of risk predicating a repeat of the 1755 tsunami: the tectonic plate subduction, the global warming, and this major landslip. So there we are. Well, that's the take-home message now of Plato's Atlantis story, and I'll run through it. Atlantis was a prehistoric trading centre located in the Algarve, destroyed by a tsunami striking the Algarve coast. Today, sea levels are rising fast as glaciers and icebergs melt due to global warming. I call it the infrared radiation problem. That tsunamis are now more likely in the Northwestern Atlantic, like the Algarve and Lisbon 1755 event, but this time there are not just 60,000 people living in Lisbon, there are 500,000. And the coastal populations are very much higher than they ever were in the 2004 tsunami which affected the Indian Ocean. And that the warning in Plato's two dialogues, of hubris and nemesis, is that really mankind should not be tampering with nature the way we are. Mankind today still thinks we're better than nature. Some people are totally ignoring the situation, but it does require urgent attention. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this rather somber talk, and that you'll do your best to tell other people about the hazard that we face, and maybe in time we might find a solution. Thank you very much.